Assalamualaikum, brothers and sisters. Inshallah, you're all doing well. May Allah give you all the tawfiq to be able to fast and obtain all your goals and aspirations in this very blessed month. I'm honored to be with you and hope that this conversation will be helpful. This is one of the main drivers of why I wanted to have these sessions, is this very topic that we're going to talk about today, which is insulin resistance. And it is one of the factors in which many populations around the world, including those of us here in the United States, and of course, as I mentioned yesterday in my introduction around fasting, and my motivation on putting these presentations together is that the Muslim community in the Islamic countries are affected by it, and insulin resistance is a huge factor into why many of us are becoming sick, and many of us are losing family members, friends, members of our community, and co-workers and what have you. And so hopefully this will be a little bit of an introduction. Hopefully it'll be somewhat interactive. So if you do have questions, please let me know, and I'll again post my email so that if you're not available to review or view live, that you can feel free to always email me with questions. So let's dive right in on insulin resistance. Many of you probably heard of the term. Some people get confused between insulin resistance and glaucoma. Insulin resistance and diabetes, and why there is a correlation between the two, or what is the differentiation between the two, and can one lead to the other, or vice versa. So what insulin resistance is really your body's defense mechanism to avoid sugar, and to kind of process sugar. It's really, again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the internal moderation or regulation process by which the sugar can be addressed if and when it does come in. Now, sugar is somewhat of a generic term. I use it loosely. Sugar has many different definitions. You've probably heard the term carbohydrates. You've also heard the term glucose. You've heard the term fructose. You've heard the term table sugar. You've heard the term, sugar alcohols, and any of these things. And we'll dive into some of them. We won't be able to cover all of it, but some of it today. So insulin is intended, and it's put out to keep the blood sugar below 100 milligrams per deciliter. That's ultimately the goal. That's where we want to be. Anything above that becomes majorly problematic. And so insulin is a hormone, and it is created to be able to, again, internally regulate the sugar process. The issue is, we'll talk about, is when insulin becomes resistant. And I'll give you some examples of when that is, when and how that is. But let's ask the first question, which would be the question I would ask myself, is why does sugar need to be less than 100 milligrams per deciliter? Why is it not okay for it to be above that? And bottom line is, sugar is toxic. The body doesn't want sugar, doesn't need it. And if any of you were with us yesterday, or were able to watch the video yesterday, I talked about there's three main macronutrients that many of you are aware of. We have fats, protein, and carbohydrates. We need those three to be able to process, and our body needs it for fuel and energy. And so, again, repeating what I said yesterday, which is really important, we have essential fatty acids that our body has to get exogenously, meaning we have to consume these fatty acids. So things like fish, salmon, nuts, seeds, olives, olive oils, and those types of things. These are essential fatty acids that we have to take in, otherwise our body won't be able to survive. So we need these exogenously, versus the term endogenously. You'll hear me say it, or you might read about it. Endogenous is when the body creates it internally. The other one is protein, which is the building block of that is amino acids. And you've probably heard the term essential amino acids. Again, something that we have to take in. Those would be things like beef, chicken, eggs, lamb, veal, anything else, even fish, again, has protein. Any kind of protein that's taken in as part of an essential amino acid is the building block to be able to build muscle and also build tissue within your body. Now, the question I asked yesterday, and the question we all have to ask ourselves is there anything that is essential carbohydrate? And the answer is absolutely no. So technically, we don't even need to consume carbohydrates. The body is beautifully designed, so elegantly designed, that if we're in that hunger state or starvation state, and I gave the examples of people in Gaza or anywhere else that suffer an earthquake here in the United States or in any country where they're in rubble and they dig them out, that these people survive after days, sometimes weeks. Right. And it's astonishing. We all probably sit there and think to ourselves, how did they do it? It must be a miracle. Allah gave this a miracle. Well, he did. He gave us this miracle of our body being able to tap into our own system reserve. So this is why, and we'll talk about this in a minute, the science of where insulin comes in, where the body can go and grab storage just for those, quote unquote, in case situations that happen where we're starving or we don't have access to food or we're fasting or what have you. The body can then go in and dive into the fat, break it down. And we talked about again yesterday how when the fat's broken down, it'll be turned into water. So that way we don't get dehydrated. And like I said, as I mentioned yesterday, dry fasting is really critical for that, where you actually have the balance of your electrolytes and you stay hydrated throughout that whole entire process. So subhanAllah, very, very, very precise and elegantly perfected design. So again, going back to those three essential, the three macronutrients. So again, carbohydrates do not have to be consumed. Sometimes our bodies feel like they need it, and we can delve into it and tap into it in a more natural format. Some people brought up yesterday in the dialogue around fruits and vegetables, perfect sources of carbohydrates. But what the body doesn't like is sugar in its artificial form, and even most oftentimes, sometimes excess in natural form. So glucose is spread throughout the whole entire body. So when we consume glucose, and these are things like berries and apples and bananas and vegetables, all sorts of vegetables. A perfect example I would think of is beets that we would eat, or any other type of a vegetable. Most vegetables will have some sort of carbohydrate built into it. And again, most fruits have it automatically built into it. That gives it that sweet taste. The sweeter the taste, the higher the glucose level. And so in that case, the body or the glucose goes in, it spreads throughout the body, and then the insulin is released. And we'll talk about that in a minute. However, the glucose is not a preferred source of fuel for the body. So your body doesn't necessarily want it or doesn't have to have it, but it knows what to do with it. And that's where the insulin comes in to do its job. Now, what's interesting is on the flip side, fat is preferred by the body. So when we consume fat and the body consumes fat, it doesn't reject it. And it doesn't, call out an alarm, and there's no insulin release to go take care of this. So that sugar becomes problematic, hence why at 100 milligrams per deciliter, the brain and the body go into a hypervigilant state. And so what's the ramifications if it does go above? If it does go above, many of you have heard the term, obviously, diabetes, but there are many other causes of issues beyond just diabetes. neuropathy. So this is where you get tingling in your fingertips or in your toes. You might feel like pins and needles in there. And we'll talk about that in a minute in terms of symptomology. Neuropathy, not only in the peripheral nerves, but also in your brain, and any other nerve within your body can become affected. The big one, I would say this is the big one, is heart disease. So when you have sugar that goes up and the insulin can't keep up and you become insulin resistant, that can result in heart disease. And that's one of the top killers, if not the number one killer, related to insulin resistance. Then, shortly thereafter, that one is stroke. So a lot of patients that have stroke, I personally have friends, family members, and what have you, that were somewhat thin. They exercised. They were overall seemed very healthy, but they all of a sudden suffered a stroke, and you wonder what happened, right? And so, insulin resistance, the first thing that goes up, and we'll talk about some of the statistics, which is very alarming in terms of insulin resistance in the United States. And then around the world, it even sometimes gets worse. The bigger part, actually, that this is kind of like the, I would say, the gatekeeper to all these diseases is inflammation. So inflammation can result in diabetes, inflammation can result in stroke, inflammation can certainly result in heart disease. And then the most common one that inflammation results in is also cancer. So insulin resistance can result also in cancer as well. And oftentimes that's the culprit. Cancer needs fuel. It gets the fuel from the sugar, and the body goes through this wicked cycle of feeding the nutrients. So we're basically, by what we eat and how our body behaves, we could be helping and assisting cancer rather than cutting it off. And we talked about yesterday in terms of the blessings of this holy month and the dry fasting and that impact that it has to cancer cells and killing the, if you remember, the term that we used was autophagy, xenophagy. That is intended to exactly do that in a very early stage, is to nip the cancer cells early on before they can develop and grow. And then a big other factor is visceral fat. So this is not, when you look at people, I know when I had a belly on me a few years back, where you could, you can see people's bellies, or one can see one's own belly. That is not visceral fat. So that is outside of the tissue. Visceral fat actually goes around the tissue. So most commonly, the places that you'll see this is around organs. And so things like your liver, spleen, other organs, gallbladder, things like that, where visceral fat can build around it, that becomes a problem because that almost kind of suffocates the organ, and then it becomes a big concern. And typically, we'll talk about this in a minute, the visceral fat builds around the liver, and this is where it becomes problematic with insulin resistance. And as we know, and I know many of you experience, I know I have, sugar also wears off very quickly. So this is another reason why the body doesn't like it and doesn't prefer it. Fat goes in and keeps you satiated. So I'll give you a perfect example. If you have usually one salmon or you have a handful of walnuts, maybe while you're breaking your fast, you have some walnuts, or you think about, having any other type of kind of fat-filled food, let's say an avocado, let's say other types of meat that might be a little bit fattier, milk or yogurt or cottage cheese, any of these things that have fat in it, you can't eat too much. You have a little bit and you feel full. And the reason for that is because the insulin doesn't get released, and the body, accepts that fat, and it says, I'm good. And there's a signal goes to the brain that says, I'm satiated, my cells are full, you fed me, leave me alone, no more food is necessary. You get that satisfaction in your brain, and you can move on and do whatever you need to do. On the flip side, when you have sugar and you get the spike of the sugar, it goes up, insulin's released, goes, grabs the sugar, puts it into the cells. There's other sugar floating around, or in the case of insulin resistance, you have a lot of sugar floating around, not getting into the cells. And then what happens is now the cells don't get fulfilled because sugar doesn't last long enough. So now the brain says, I need more food. Give me more food. I need something. I'm hungry. And it'll start sending different hormones. We talked about yesterday, ghrelin, and the brain has to start eating. And this is why I seriously doubt if anybody can eat, let's say 5, 10 or more avocados. Me personally, I have one and I'm totally good to go. Or you can't have a whole can of yogurt. You'll feel sick afterwards. Or try to drink a whole gallon of milk. It's not going to really work. However, we can all, and I know I've been a victim of this, we can sit down and eat a whole big, huge tub of popcorn. Or we can go through, without even thinking, go through a whole bag of potato chips. Maybe eat the whole bag. And I know I've done this when I was a little kid, where you eat cookies, a whole bag of cookies. That's because the brain will keep saying, send me more, I'm not satisfied. So fat and protein will satiate the brain and the body, whereas sugar or carbohydrates will not. That will wear off very quickly. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. Next time, if you, or in the past, when you have Chinese food, no offense to the Chinese population, but next time you have Chinese food, I know I've had this, you eat and you feel like you got full. And then maybe about an hour or 2 hours later, think to yourself, God, I had so much of that lo mein, or I had so much fried rice, but I feel hungry. And oftentimes it was interesting because I would eat the Chinese food or any other type of starchy food, and I would now want to, top it off with like dessert. Whereas if you have a big juicy steak, or you have, lamb, or you have a big piece of salmon, or any other type of fish, typically you don't want that dessert. You're good. I'm full, but my stomach's good. I won't have dessert. But it's amazing how often I would have these starchy foods, especially like Chinese food. And then the next one was either a dessert afterwards, or running to get some ice cream or something, because the brain's saying I need more. So this is the reason why insulin and insulin resistance can become problematic if the insulin becomes resistant to its action or activity. Now, one thing to keep in mind, I know I talked about this a little bit yesterday, is ketones. And ketones as fuel. And that's, interestingly, when you look at the data, the body needs about 85% of its fuel in the form of ketones. So this is fat. And only 15% of it from glucose. So you can actually, again, eat a very little amount of, let's say, berries or vegetables or something like that, and you'll get what you need. Because like I mentioned yesterday, and I'll say it again today, the body can tap into itself endogenously. Now this time it's going within itself and actually create glucose by taking fat that's in and around tissues and converting it into sugar or to carbohydrate. And that there's a term called gluconeogenesis. And that's basically that the body is creating that sugar by taking fat and converting it. And then, as we talked about yesterday, also turns into water that keeps you satisfied. So this is actually an ideal situation where you would be in this ketosis, which we're in now. So all of us at 5:22 p.m. Pacific time, we're all in a ketoacidotic state. And the reason why, or ketotic state, the reason why we're in a ketotic state right now is because we're dry fasting. And so right now, if they measured our blood or they could test our breath, we're releasing ketones rather than releasing sugar. This is why we all feel mentally sharp. We have probably a little bit tired now, but by day 15, which congratulations to all of you, we're halfway now through this glorious month, which actually is a sad time for me because I think about it as only 2 more weeks left in this beautiful month. But anyways, we're in a ketotic state. And so that's less stressful on the body. There's less waste happening within the body. And so therefore, this is allowing us to be fully optimized, and our body's actually taking the carbs within our body and it's breaking it down to give us the feel that's how we survive. Because the body is saying, I remember now when Omid was eating the food and he ate the carbohydrates at suhoor, or when he ate the carbohydrate or the berries at night for dessert. I know why I had to go and put that into the cells. I had to go store it because I know Omid one day was going to get really hungry and he's going to need fuel. So I know where to go get that fuel. I'm going to go tap into that cell, take those carbohydrates, take the fat, and now I'm going to convert it back into carbohydrates to give Omid the energy for him to be able to do his workouts and go for his walks or runs and be able to survive and function. Some of us more than others, and we'll talk about why that's the case. So again, one thing to keep in mind, insulin is an anabolic hormone. So it is there to build reserves for you. So if you hear the term or you're talking to people and they talk, or you read in articles where as you're researching, or you hear maybe your doctor might be sophisticated enough to use this term and they use the word anabolic, that means to build. As opposed to catabolic, which is to break down. So insulin is actually a good thing. We need insulin. Insulin is our friend at times when we need it. Insulin can build muscle. So for those of us that exercise, we work out, we're trying to build muscle, we want to release insulin. But what we don't want to do is abuse it to where now insulin becomes resistant. And so it becomes a friend, or it can become potentially a foe at that point. So one thing to keep in mind, if any of you are actually, monitoring yourselves, I know that's become a big thing nowadays for people to monitor their sugar level. So a lot of people might ask, well, what's normal? If you were to graph it, you want a stable line going across. So let's say throughout the day, throughout the week or month, you're plotting your blood sugar level, or if you have one of those blood sugar monitors, glucose monitors, that's important to keep it within a certain band and not have these spikes going up and down, what we call hypoglycemia going down and hyperglycemia going up. So your ideal, I would say, when after you've eaten, so let's say you've had suhoor, or you had iftar, your blood sugar level should be somewhere between about 80 to 120. It should stay within that band. Whereas when we're fasting, so we're in a state right now, let's say if somebody was hooking me up to a glucose monitor, I should be ideally in about 75 to 85. And this is measured in milligrams per deciliter. So I want to be within that range. And of course, many of you who go to your blood test with your doctor, they usually tell you go and fast it. They stick a needle in you, and then they measure it at that point. And so if that's the case and you're going in once a year or once every few months or what have you, remember that when you're going in fasting, ideally you want to be somewhere between 75 to 85 and keep it within that range. That is your blood sugar. There's another value that we'll talk about, actually 2 more values that we'll talk about related to insulin resistance. They'll be very important, as well as diabetes. One thing to keep in mind, which is really interesting, there's 2 sides to this coin, which is always the case. You have excess glucose being toxic. So if you have too much sugar floating around, that could be toxic. And that can actually, believe it or not, in people, and this, I've seen this, I had patients when I was in residency where they went into a coma because of too much sugar. And these are people that typically haven't been diagnosed with diabetes. In my case, the case I had, a patient actually went into coma right into our office, was a patient that they were called, I think the Church of Scientology, I believe it was, or I can't remember exactly now where it was, where they, I'm sorry, I think it was a Latter-day Saints, where they don't go to doctors, or this person was refusing to go to the doctor. And so their blood sugar, I think, was somewhere in like 400 range. And the patient unfortunately went into a coma. But alhamdulillah, they recovered. But that was an incident where the glucose went up too high. Now, what's interesting is that you can have that very same issue on the other end of the spectrum. So you could have someone that has too much insulin, so what we call hyperinsulinemia, where they have little glucose, and these patients can actually go into coma as well. So this is where we have type 1 diabetics, and if they're not careful and they don't monitor their insulin very well, or they don't eat according to the insulin level that they put in, they can actually end up in the hospital and end up in a coma. So, so this is how critical all this stuff can be. So let's talk a little bit. I mean, I think we talked about it, but let's get into a little bit more of the details. What causes insulin resistance? So we talked about eating too much carbs, more than what your body needs or should have, and eating the wrong types of carbs, sugars. And all of us are victims of it, including myself. But the bigger part of it, which this was the big issue for me, that was I think the aha moment that really changed my life around, and it ties into this glorious month, is eating too often. So as I mentioned yesterday, unfortunately, many of us are told, and the food companies promote this wrongfully. And unfortunately, you go to your doctor and oftentimes they tell you this, or you go to nutritionists and they tell you this, make sure you have at least 3 meals. Make sure you fill the gaps with snacks. So these are starting with even our children, where they're eating breakfast before they leave the house, and not probably the healthiest of breakfast, like cereal and sugary cereals or what have you, oatmeal, cookies, what have you. And then in the middle of the day or middle of the morning, they're given snacks at school. So now they eat at least one snack break. Then they eat a lunch. And typically for lunch, what do we all, or they all eat? Something with pasta, rice, bread, all these types of things. And then you have afternoon snack. And that could be maybe potentially fruit. It could be cookies, it could be candy, it could be ice cream, whatever. And then they come home, maybe have another snack, or we'll have another snack. We'll have like a little something after we get home from work, and then there's dinner. So now if you add that up, you had 3 main meals, probably not the healthiest. And then you have at least 2 snacks split in between the day. So now you're up to potentially 5 times a day that you're eating, if not more. And for me, I'll speak with my own experience. When I was getting nervous when I was at work, and I was busy, sometimes it was just easy because of the stress. It would be like my old boss used to call it mindless eating, where he and I would just talk. And while we're talking, we just slowly kind of walk over into the cafeteria at the work site that we had. And there, of course, they had all sorts of snacks laid out, what we would call, what people call protein bars, which are, I call them candy bars. Or you'd have, soda, you'd have other types of sugary drinks like Gatorade and things like that. And so we would just mindlessly go there and maybe have, pour ourselves, for me, a cup of tea. He would have a cup of coffee. And of course, you can't just have that coffee or the tea by itself. So you got to grab either some nuts that had like maybe M&Ms in it, or a bowl of, the pasta noodles or something, and you would eat it with that. And, it's this type of thing that you're just eating that overburdens the insulin, and the cells just can't keep up. And the example I always like to give, I'm a big soccer or football fan. So think of the stadium as your cell, as the cell within your body. You have the fans, the supporters that are glucose, and then you have the seats in the stadium that are insulin. So as the fans come in and the supporters come into the cell, then the seats act as insulin, basically putting you in. I'm kind of putting it backwards because typically the chair, the seat, would grab you, almost kind of thinking of it in future terms. Maybe at some point this will happen in the future, sometime maybe in 50, 60 years, or maybe I'm off, maybe it'll be sooner, where the chair, you'll walk in, you'll check in at the stadium, the chair will come in and basically lift you up and go put you where you're supposed to be seated at the stadium. So if you kind of vision it that way, that's the insulin. The chair is the insulin, you as the fan or supporter are the glucose, and then the stadium is the cell. So you go in and you sit. Now imagine if they oversold the stadium. So let's imagine 75,000 capacity stadium. So there should be ideally 75,000 seats, right? But yet you sold 100,000 seats. And so now you have 25,000 people waiting to get a seat, but yet there's no room. There's no insulin. So what's going to happen to all these people? They're going to overflow. And that overflowing has to go somewhere. Where does it go? It goes into the bloodstream. And if you remember back to what I said a few minutes ago around that 100 milligrams per deciliter, now you got all this blood sugar floating around, and this can become problematic and go up to the brain. And if that blood sugar gets high enough, then you can get into a coma, or you get other symptoms, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So again, we talked about what are the causes. Eating more carbs than you need. And again, there's no essential carbohydrate, so you don't really need it. But let's say we have too much. So let's say too much of a good thing is a bad thing. Let's say I say I'm going to eat a whole tub of blueberries. A little bit of blueberries, good. Too much blueberries, problematic. If you remember back to the ayah that I mentioned yesterday from the Quran, the Holy Quran, it tells us not to be in excess. And it's not just talking about wastefulness, but also being excessful to our body and doing damage to ourselves. So too much carbs, eating too often, we talked about that, and then sugar. And the sugar, we talked about, there's the glucose, which comes in the vegetables and the fruits, and that spreads throughout the body. But the two big ones, there's one that becomes not part of a second one, is fructose. Fructose is poison to the body, and the body recognizes it as such. And so the only place that the fructose can get processed or detoxified is in the liver. So if there's too much fructose floating around, and these are things like what you find in ketchup, ice cream, cookies, most anything, if you read labels, if we get to the time today, inshallah, I'll go over and give an example of how to read a label. But if not, subsequent next week, inshallah, I'll make sure I prioritize that and walk through how to read a food label. But the fructose can only get processed within the liver. And the only other thing that causes that is something of which we don't participate in, but it becomes a problem for the liver as well. And many of you know this is alcohol. And so fructose behaves just like alcohol. It can only go to the liver. It's the only place it can get processed. And if we give the liver too much to process, then the liver can enlarge or what we call fatty liver. And this is what can then result in insulin resistance, because it's just a backup and the liver says, I can't handle this anymore. And when it does that and the insulin can't do its thing, insulin becomes resistant. And again, thinking back to fans can't get into the stadium. They can't get seated into the stadium. And this is actually, sadly, one of the things that really scares me for the younger generation is that this is quite common. Fatty liver right now they found is quite common. Most of the literature you look at will say that there is a tremendous rise in fatty liver, not only in adults, but especially in our children. And there's multiple factors at play here. Obviously, lack of exercise, more of a sedentary lifestyle, but first and foremost, it's the horrific eating patterns that these children have with eating sugary drinks, sugary snacks, foods. Then on top of that, having rice, pasta, all sorts of carb-loaded, starchy type foods that can wreak havoc on the liver, and the liver can really become, wasted, unfortunately. So something to be very mindful of if you have children, especially younger children. Really, really, you need to take care of what they eat, and especially take care of their liver, because they're going to have to live with that the rest of their life. And I would say this is probably just a personal opinion. It is one of the most critical organs in your body. Obviously, arguably, but to me, fatty liver can be the beginning of many problems in the future. So here's a question you need to ask yourself or any of your loved ones. Are you or are they insulin resistant? So we know that from the data that has come out, 50% are 50% of the U.S. population is insulin resistant. That's astonishing to me. 50% is amazing, and I think that's actually on the lower end. I've seen statistics even much higher than that. And 50% of those, so 50% of patients that are, or people that are insulin resistant will result in type 2 diabetes. So whoever's on this session right here or within your family, think of 50% of your family members or of people within your masjid. As you look around, 50% of them are insulin resistant. And then another 50% of those are going to end up getting diabetes, which is really scary when you really think about it. So this is something not to be undervalued. So what are some of the things that you'll see or signs? So one of the things that's somewhat common, but I think it goes hand in hand with many other parts, is acanthosis nigricans. So this is where the skin cells produce very quickly, they reproduce very quickly, and you end up getting dark spots, certain dark spots within your skin. Now, just in isolation, this may not be the case, but if you start seeing dark spots and tags around your body, around your skin, especially around like the belly area, things like that, that's something definitely to be watchful for. But there are many other symptoms that come with it, so don't get freaked out if it's just that one. Tingling, we talked about numbness and tingling is in essence neuropathy, and that's where the nerves are damaged and the brain can't send the signals. So it starts telling you something's wrong, and that's where you get the tingling and sensation, and usually your periphery in your fingertips, hands, feet, toes, that type of thing. Another one you probably are all very familiar with is peeing a lot, urinating or going to the bathroom. The kidneys filter the glucose. So as the kidney is filtering it, it pulls in water to be able to release it. Because remember what I said about the sugar floating around in your body, and the glucose goes around. Because remember, fructose, liver, glucose all throughout. Then the kidneys have to process the glucose. And when it processes it, it grabs water. So as it does that, you start urinating more. And hand in hand with that is excessive thirst. So as you pee more, you get excessive thirst. And you have to keep drinking more, and it becomes a cycle. Another big one, as I mentioned, I gave the example of eating Chinese food or anything that's starchy, is you get hungry after you eat. So you just ate, and then you just ate, and you're like, did I just eat? Or maybe I just didn't eat enough. Or, boy, I thought I just ate a plate and I was done. I was fine 20, 30 minutes ago or an hour ago, and now back I'm hungry again. that's typically a sign of insulin resistance. And then another big thing you may or may not experience is if you start to get recurrent infections, or if things become slow healing. And that's because you're getting a decrease and issues with the white blood cells. So these are the common signs and symptoms that you'll typically see along with what I just described. So weight gain, that was my number one big issue, was weight gain, and I could not lose it. I was stuck no matter what I did, however hard I worked out, ran and walked miles and miles. I was trying to be careful about what I eat, and I was gaining weight and couldn't lose it. Soon as I went, and we'll talk about this in a minute, soon as I went into intermittent fasting, and I cut out carbs, no more carbs, I cut out the sweets, I was really careful about my diet, I immediately dropped 10 pounds. And when I say immediately, within 1 to 2 weeks, lost 10 pounds, and alhamdulillah, I have not gained, and I'm monitoring now what I eat. So sometimes maybe my carbs go up a little bit, and then I'll kind of drop it back down, and that weight comes right back down. But the intermittent fasting, that's a non-negotiable for me. Belly fat, I think we talked about that. Sugar craving. So if you start craving sugar, now it's interesting. I used to crave sugar. I used to pick up my son from school on a hot day, and then we would go to the Baskin Robbins and get ice cream, or we would go somewhere else and get something sugary. And there was a desire to have that. Now I know that there's birthday parties that I go to, and they serve cake, and I see all the kids eating the cream and all the everything on top of it. I get repulsed by it now, and it's because my insulin level is tapered off. So you'll actually lose the sugar cravings, and you won't desire it as much. And in fact, when you look at it, it doesn't even look appealing anymore. Persistent hunger, we just talked about. Do you get it? Then this is something I used to always get: sleepy after you eat. So if you eat, and especially depending on what you eat, if you get sleepy after you eat, that's pretty much a signal to you that that's insulin being a problem. So when you eat, you should get fuel. You should feel better. You should feel energized. You should feel awake, which is what happens to me. I usually eat more fats, protein. I've tried to increase. I stay low on carbs. And ever since I've done that, I don't get sleepy. Before, I used to get very, very sleepy after I ate. And so that's something that's huge. Fatigue is another big one. If you're tired all the time, or you get tired after you eat, that's another problem. High blood pressure, cholesterol level starts to go up. If you start getting brain fog, and you can't just think right, you're like, God, something's not sharp with me. And I know during Ramadan, alhamdulillah, we've been all feeling probably a lot sharper than we normally do. And that's because your insulin is down and you're in that ketotic state. And then we already talked about the fatty liver. So what are the causes of insulin resistance? I think we talked about most of it. Consumption of sugars, carbohydrates, lack of physical activity. Those are really, really the big ones. So making sure, one of the things I will suggest during the month of Ramadan, please continue to keep your physical activity, whatever that may be. Interestingly, there's a lot of data that comes out that says that if you eat and then you go for a walk, you will decrease insulin spikes, sugar spikes, and also your insulin, and decrease your chance of insulin resistance. Another literature that came out, I think it was about a year ago, and it was propagated big time, was actually interestingly doing calf raises. So as I stand at my desk, I have a standing desk. I'll just stand here after I eat, let's say breakfast. I don't really eat breakfast or lunch, but I'll just stand here and just do, calf raises. Or you could do it if you're sitting down at your chair and just do calf raises. What's really interesting is they found, for whatever reason, the soleus muscle, which is in the calf muscle, actually will decrease your sugar level. So if you do have a high carbohydrate meal, so even if you're at the masjid, let's say you're breaking your fast, as you're breaking your fast, just sit in your chair and just do calf raises. And that will bring your sugar in your insulin levels down, interestingly. But the ideal situation is to go for a walk. That way you get movement, and you also get the oxygen as well. We talked about the foods, staying away from them, and trying to be careful of what you do eat. There was a research article, I think it was in Missouri Medicine, that found a direct link. They published, which I just talked about, a direct link between carbohydrate consumption and the risk of developing insulin resistance. And here's what they summarized. So this is verbatim that I pulled right out of the article. It was starches and sugars increase fasting insulin levels, reduce insulin sensitivity, and reduce cellular insulin binding. So this is even scientifically, obviously, proven. Sedentary lifestyle, you need to be really careful of. Make sure you get up and walk around. At one point, we'll talk about this. They call it NEAT, which is well published now, that actually you can lose more fat and control your blood sugar much better by doing NEAT, which is non-exercise active thermogenesis. So this is things like washing the dishes, doing laundry, cleaning around the house, just being active. You could even do what I call exercise snacks. So let's say you're working, and then all of a sudden you just drop down and do burpees, or you do some squats or push-ups, or you start doing jumping jacks, or go up and down stairs, something like that. Those are little exercise snacks that you can throw into your day, and that will help burn more fat and fuel than let's say a lot of people I know, friends of mine, and I used to think like this too. They get up, they might go to the gym, or they do their exercise at home first thing in the morning, and then they go to work and they sit for the next 8 hours, and then they come home, cook dinner, eat, sit, watch TV. And they think, oh, well, I did my workout this morning, so pat myself on the back and I did my job. Well, no, the rest of the time you sat, somewhat sedentary, or vice versa. You get up, you eat breakfast, you do all your stuff, you go to work, sit for 8 hours, then you come home, then you slam out a quick workout, high intensity interval training, you go for a run, whatever you do. But that period during the day, you didn't do anything. So that non-exercise active thermogenesis will actually get you in a much better state. And that could be just little movements throughout the day. And then, of course, family history becomes another big issue as well. So how to assess that you have it objectively? Tests, we talked about fasting blood sugar. The hemoglobin A1C is another test. That's a 3-month average of where your blood sugar is. This is a much more accurate test. So this would be a blood test that you would get at the doctor's office or at the clinic, LabCorp, Quest, what have you. And so the values, less than 5.3, you're in great shape. You're doing fantastic. If you're 5.3 to 5.7, you need to be very careful, watchful. And this is where you need to start monitoring your diet and exercise and being really careful. 5.7 to 6.4, now you're in the pre-diabetic stage. So this is kind of, now you better be on vigilant alert and really make drastic changes. Greater than 6.5, now you're diabetic. Now you're officially in type 2 or type 1 diabetes. So that's one test, and we'll talk about the other ones. One thing I just wanted to say here in this one article that I pulled up, and I thought the percentages were higher. There's one article that indicated that 80% of actually the U.S. population is insulin resistant, 75% is overweight. So these are astounding numbers. So now I gave you the example of 50%, which is on the lower end. So imagine now 80%. So if you have 5 people within your household, 4 of you are going to be insulin resistant, which is really scary. The big test, I think, and I'll share this on my screen so you can see it as well, is what we call a HOMA-IR. The HOMA stands for Homeostatic Model Assessment for Insulin Resistance. And this you want, within a very, very tight range. I will share my screen so you can see what, and this is a test that the doctors can do. And you can have this done. Here we go. For you. A lot of doctors don't do it, but this is the HOMA-IR test, and these are the values. So it's probably a test you've never heard of before, and unfortunately, a lot of doctors don't do it. I mentioned it yesterday. A lot of doctors do not test for insulin. So ask your doctor to do this test, especially if you're at risk. And like I said, 80% of us have it. Some of us don't even know about it. And it's a good test to get done regularly. I would talk to your doctor. If they don't want to do it, find a professional that will. So you want 1 point less than 1, you're in fantastic state. If you get up to greater than 1.9, now you're insulin resistant. Greater than 2.9, you've got big issues. You're practically in a diabetic state. So again, HOMA-IR, homeostasis model assessment of insulin resistance. Really important test to get done. And then next questions, and we'll spend just a couple of minutes, is it possible to reverse it? And absolutely. So we're doing one of them right now. And maybe you can continue it, the fasting. I personally like the 16-8. Sometimes I kind of go up and down a little bit. Sometimes I won't eat for maybe 18 hours or so. Sometimes maybe 14 hours. Regularly, it'll be somewhere around 14 to 16. But fasting, if you can continue to do fasting afterwards, after Ramadan is over, just keep that momentum going, and that will really help it. There is no medication at this time, so really it's diet and other methods. For food, I should say one more thing, and this sounds easy, but Journal of Physiology said weight loss will correlate with insulin resistance, which no-brainer, right? And so that's one of the big things, but how do we get there? That's the question. Big thing, anybody that's talked to me, I'm a big advocate of vitamin D, high doses of vitamin D. I personally myself take 10,000. I think anything less than 5,000 is not enough. 10,000 international units is what UC San Diego recommends, and most doctors in functional medicine or integrative medicine, or any doctors that are involved in vitamin D research will recommend 10,000. And that could be either via pills, or you could spend time outside, preferably in the sun. And so one day we'll talk probably more about the sun and the blessings that Allah has given us through the sun. But this is one of them. Vitamin D is absolutely critical for many things, but it has been studied and published that vitamin D levels that are sufficient, that are well maintained, will decrease insulin resistance and other metabolic disorders. There was a recent publication that came out that said fenugreek, actually. So many Indians and Pakistanis cook with this. That's that very distinct smell that you get with curries or what have you. So I take fenugreek and I grind it up. I get the fenugreek seeds, I blend it up, and then use it as a tea. And I drink it, and it tastes absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Sometimes maybe you can put a little bit of honey if you don't like the taste, but fenugreek has been known in published literature to control blood sugar as well as insulin levels. Apple cider vinegar, I think anybody that knows me knows I'm a huge fan of apple cider vinegar. Tons of published data, including medical journals, that say apple cider vinegar is one of the best things for diabetics, what have you. So apple cider vinegar, ideally diluted, so maybe a tablespoon within 8 ounce of water will control your blood sugar. It's probably a really good thing to have during iftar and suhoor as well. Cinnamon is the third one that was published. So I add cinnamon to everything. Whatever I'm eating, I add cinnamon to it. That's also been known to establish, and it's got much antioxidant levels. The only thing you have to be careful with cinnamon excess is oxalate. So those of you that are at risk for kidney stones, be careful with excess cinnamon, but otherwise within levels, very safe to use. Thiamine, which is a natural form of B1, and you get this in like red meat, what have you. Chromium, again, is in red meat and most animal products. Zinc and copper keep those balanced, but zinc is really good for men for testosterone as well, control, and overall immunity help support for both men and women. But make sure that you're not taking excess, because then that can deplete your copper. So you want to make sure there's about a 10-to-1 ratio between zinc to copper that you want to be taking. Berberine, there's been a ton of published data. Berberine acts in a similar pathway as metformin, which is used to treat diabetics. So there's a lot of publications for berberine. So that's a huge also benefit for fat loss, weight control, and also insulin resistance and blood sugar control. In fact, many patients right now are using berberine in lieu of the GLP-1s or the metformins and what have you. Potassium, which I talked about yesterday, is very important. Omega-3 fatty acids, which I talked about yesterday, is really important. Magnesium, we'll talk about that one day, very, very critical. So how are the things to improve insulin sensitivity? We talked about the low carb diet. Try to keep your carbs as low as possible. Ideally, very difficult, below 50 grams. If you can't do that, try to stay at least under 100, but the lower the better. 16-8 fast, which is what I use. So you're fasting 16 hours, eating windows 8. Try not to eat more than 2 meals, ideally in a day, that with no snacks in between. That would be the ideal situation. Definitely prioritize your sleep. In a diabetic care article, it was published that lack of sleep or insufficient sleep can impact insulin resistance and weight gain. And that was also one of my issues with insomnia. Reduce your stress. In the publication Neuroendocrinology, they found that psychological stress is tied to insulin levels. So breathing techniques, and one day we'll talk about that. We're using breathing techniques, also meditation, and of course, nothing better than the Quran, Ramadan, to decrease our stress levels. And then be careful with the fruits and vegetables that you get, as much as you can, non-GMO organic vegetables, as much as you can grass-fed beef, as much as you can wild-caught fish, so wild-caught salmon, as much as you can pasture-raised eggs. Stay away from other types of eggs. They can be extremely harmful. And then be careful with this, but in moderation, full-fat organic dairy, grass-fed ideally, but try to go full-fat if and when you can. That way you eat less, you're more satiated. Low-fat, people have a tendency to eat more. So you want to be careful with that. And so I got right up on time. I apologize if I took up too much time. Feel free to ask any questions while we have a minute. Would you recommend having suhoor? Absolutely. Great question. So definitely recommend having suhoor because it's going to be very difficult. Now, if you can go without, there's many people that do one meal a day just throughout the year, not just Ramadan, and that is even more fantastic. But if you can't, depending on your age and your metabolic level and what your activities and things, I think you want to, and we'll probably talk about this one day, this non-exercise active thermogenesis. What we found is that if you eat less, then you're less active throughout the day. So if you don't eat suhoor and you get tired, what are you going to be more doing? You're going to be sedentary, and that's probably more harmful. So my suggestion would be, if you feel that suhoor will give you enough energy to get through until iftar, then my suggestion is have suhoor. But have a moderate suhoor. Don't have anything excessive. Be careful, again, of the carbs. If you load up on the carbs, that spike, and then you're going to get actually more hungry. So maybe things like an avocado, or have eggs or egg whites, or maybe have peanut butter or some sort of nut butter mixed in there. Yogurt's fantastic for in the mornings, things like that. Those will keep you going throughout the day. But great question. And then it was interesting. So the insulin resistance is caused by carbohydrates, 100%. So I think you guys I think most everybody answered that early. So the answer is partly yes. Partly yes, it can be, but there's a lot more factors. And actually, I would say eating more often is probably worse than carbohydrates. Because if you think about younger kids, athletes. I know, like when I was playing soccer, we'd eat a lot of carbs. So you can eat the carbs, but then we do what we do. So if you want to have carbs, let's say at iftar, then we're fasting and we're going to burn those carbs. But the excessive eating becomes actually more of an issue than anything else. And with that, I don't want to hold you all up as you prepare for your iftar and going into your massages. So may Allah bless you. Please keep me and my family in your du'as, and I'll be thinking of all of you. And inshallah, you have a very healthy, happy, joyous evening and iftar with your families and at your massages. And I wish you the best. And inshallah, I will see you all tomorrow afternoon, and we'll try to talk more mental health tomorrow, and I'll focus on talking a little bit something different. As a side note, if there's any recommendations you have in terms of topics, whether this style presentation is working for you, if there's something you want improved, I don't get offended. I'm looking here to help. So if there's anything I can do to serve you better, I'm at your service. And again, I will type in my email in here, so you can feel free to keep this and share it with your friends and family. And so if you have any questions, by all means, I'm at your service. May Allah bless you all and give you a blessed evening. And again, I wish you all the best. Assalamu alaikum.